G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day. Now today, as by the title, is there a mistake being made? Has there been a trap laid and Ukraine taking the bait? Now we're not going to talk of this in sense of pro-Russia or pro-Ukraine, but what we are going to do is we're going to look at some information off the front. We're going to look at what the doctrine says and what the situation has been in here, as well as what was accepted maybe earlier on in this. I'm going to lay that out and see what you think, and we'll come to a conclusion about, is this a mistake? Is this following what should be done or should not? But we also need to talk about some psychological aspects in this too. So over the recent weeks and especially recent days, we've seen the typical online cheer squad of bloggers, of propaganda celebrating then the new Ukrainian advancement here in Vovchansk. And we see this on the map that I reported on another video here, that Ukraine is clearing through the center of Vovchansk and pushing the Russians back, particularly on this eastern side, and celebrating that there's 100 Ukrainian units in here to the 30 Russian units. Now, before I lay all this out, one thing I will say is you and I, we don't have all the tools available to us that Ukrainian and Russian commanders will have to make informed tactical movements, as far as the drones, the mapping, all of this, as well as what units are specifically doing what. But in this day and age, we do have a lot at our disposal. We have, of course, the maps. We can see things. We can look at past examples. We can look at doctrine, and we can apply this to then situations. So what exactly happened and where am I really talking about? So we need to zoom out on the maps to have a look. So of course, this is Ukraine in the center, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas have been occupied since the 22 invasion, the purple since 2014. The green is areas where Russia has been at one point and has either been pushed out or has withdrawn from this area. Now you'll see this is an area where Russia has been before. This sits between the Kharkiv and Belgorod regions. Now, we come in here and some areas you'll be familiar with now in Lipsy, Holoboki, and Vovchansk. So the morning of the 10th, we see then Russia begin this cross. Now, over the next week, you can see that there is a lot of relative ground made, considering the changes that we see in the maps for the last at least 12 or 18 months. So we'll stop this here. This is the 22nd of May. And then we come to then today. So let's have a look. And this is the 25th of June. So no real massive change in here. Yeah, a bit more out to the east, but nothing too dramatic. But I thought it was accepted by everyone, officials, bloggers, everyone. But the Russian build-up in here and what actually crossed here was never enough to really have a serious threat on Kharkiv. And to this day, we still have a lot of limited footage of exactly how many crossed here. But one thing we have a massive limit of is how much armor actually crossed here from Russia. And we never saw, because we would have seen this in destroyed videos. And yes, there are videos of Ukraine destroying armor with drones and FPV, which we know they've been very efficient at, but we haven't seen anywhere near the numbers of what would need to have crossed for them to have any serious push on Kharkiv. That I thought it was fully accepted basically by everyone that what this was a ploy to then have a push in here and make Ukraine, who already is suffering from a manpower shortage and a crisis, then have to pull in reserves from other areas or pull soldiers off other areas of the front where Russia is pushing and is having success still to this day, such as Chasiv Yar, Avdiivka, Robotny, Uruzhany, New York, to pull those soldiers away up into here to try and plug that hole. And we'll talk then about the what the doctrine says in attritional warfare about this. Now, why was there so much initial success here? Now, the initial success was good Russian planning, picking an area to cross. And this good Russian planning took advantage of a failure on the other side, that there was a Ukrainian command failure caused by corruption and incompetence, where troops and defensive works were left here unprepared, leading in some areas Russia could walk basically 10 kilometers in with very limited resistance. And what this then created was a rush by Ukraine to plug this advancement and the movement of reserves into here and the movement of Ukrainian troops off other areas of the front. Now, the big win in here for Ukraine was due to the desperate nature of this. Their prayers were answered and the West lifted restrictions to use weapons inside then of Russian territory. And very quickly, we saw some of those AD systems, the Russian ones, go down. And those restrictions will flow onto other or being lifted, will flow onto other areas of the front line. Now, the big loss in here for Ukraine was, well, from all the soldiers I spoke to, the morale and motivation effect, seeing that these officials who had failed the soldiers in this direction, causing unnecessary deaths, a loss of ground, and a further thinning out of the front or in their existing directions, had a big effect on this. And the feeling that this could have been avoided if the promised and paid for defensive works were actually in that direction and manned as they should have been. And this on the back of shell starvation and manpower shortage was having and is having a huge effect on the morale and motivation of troops on the front line. As we see this, we see that positions in the south and east have been coming under Russian control every day. Now, I said we'd speak about some things in this direction. Now, what we need to speak about is where Ukraine may be going wrong on this and what offensive operations. So what we know is Ukraine is launching offensive operations back here into Vovchansk. What we need to talk about is how important is this area to pour soldiers into, and as well, what does the doctrine say at this point of the war should be doing? Now, this I've referred to, I know, many times, but I think it is incredibly relevant. The Ukraine should be falling back and inflicting what casualties they can on the way. There's no easy strategic price at the end of this line of advance for Russia. Talking in this exact direction down towards Kharkiv and looking at the lay of the ground, it's still a very difficult front for them to try and push. I think the problem for Ukraine is they put so much stock in optics, they are so narrative driven, that it absolutely skews their military decisions towards absurdity. Because of this box they've created for themselves, they feel like they have to block all progress all the time, but they have neither the manpower nor equipment for such tactics. They should be trading territory for time, especially territory like this. Burning men and machines means you have less time. And we'll look at what the doctrine says and other examples of this. But because Ukraine's strategy is absurd, they have some of their best units pouring into unfortified positions to fight the Russians out in the open, because the optics of giving that meaningless ground up are too much for them to withstand. That's probably nothing as valuable to Russia from a strategic standpoint right now than getting to fight these reserves in relatively open areas. And this is talking about how the optics skew it. So Ukraine isn't prepared to just have red appear on this map and not have to plug that and try and fight it back, even if strategically and tactically it may be the best decision to trade then territory for time. And especially, like he said, territory which isn't or hasn't been fortified correctly, fortify other areas and have that you can't get pigeonholed in these optics. We'll talk more about that and wars of which we have actually lost because of this time, and we'll look at then doctrine as well. And the one thing we have seen up in here with these fortified positions to back this up is we get videos like this. These are Ukrainian Marines entering then a Russian stronghold around Vovchansk, and you can see the build-up of this defensive position. Now, the Ukrainians in this video take the stronghold and have casualties onto the Russians, but we only see this footage because it was successful. But still, you're now breaking into dug-in defensive works, strongholds that the Russians have built in here. And we have from deep state footage like this that not only the Russians have moved in here, now they're building defensive lines, making it even more difficult for this, that you're pouring guys into now a built up area. Therefore, you're going to have higher casualties for potentially just the optics of plugging this. We'll talk a little bit more on the psychology effect that it's had down the line as well, because this really has on other guys I speak to daily on the front, seeing what happened here, going, oh, what if the command's not willing to back this up? What are we doing here? And more of our guys have to then be sent. But playing into that as well as this time and optics too, Vovchansk in here has been, this isn't even an older photo, has been basically completely destroyed. And we're seeing Russia now, some accounts are saying Russia's falling back, others are saying Ukraine is advancing. It's probably a bit of column A, bit of column B, and Russia's dropping 3,000 kilogram fab bombs on here, up to, I've heard, between 15 and 50 a day, depending on the sources. And this plays into, is this ground you're going to come in and hold, or is it better halting them somewhere else? Is this what Russia is relying on? So let's talk about defensive and offensive operations in attritional conflict. Now, the early stages of attritional war range from initiation of hostilities to the point where mobilized resources are available in large numbers and are ready for combat operations. We know Ukraine still need to have a massive mobilization to be ready for combat operations, as well as other equipment come in to bolster then those guys. Now, this takes this period. During this period, major offensive operations should be avoided. Even if large attacks are successful, they will result in significant casualties for meaningless territorial gains. Now, this is what I'll say that we don't have, or I don't have, all the tools available to a commander on this. But from outside looking in, there's no way you can take a city like this without significant casualties. And from these gains here, will this be significant? Was it significant one way or the other on the grand scheme of things? Potentially no. We know the Russians never had enough guys here to really push into Kharkiv, and they were about to hit much harder territory the further than they went. The goal is to force the enemy to expend vital materials and strategic reserves on strategically meaningless operations. And I think that Russia may have then baited that in. Maybe Ukraine's baiting them back because that's what they're saying, that Russia's pouring just men into here. But if you have a third or a quarter of the population and mobilize soldiers, you also can't maybe play that one-for-one game like this as well. Again, I don't have the tools. I don't know the actual casualty rates. I don't know how it's actually looking on the ground here, but I think it's more to do with that optics skewing things. Now, let's talk further on this. Successful attritional war focuses on the preservation of one's own combat power. This usually translates into a relatively static front interrupted by limited local attacks to improve positions, using artillery for most of the fighting. So you're improving your position using artillery for most of this, but relatively static. Fortification and concealment of all forces, including logistics, is the key to minimizing losses. The long time required to construct fortifications prevents significant ground movement. This is something we've seen Russia do well over the past 18 months. We can't expect the 2022 army in 2024, nor can the Russians expect the Ukrainian 2022 army in 2024. But defensive operations buy time to develop low-end combat formations, allowing newly mobilized troops to gain combat experience. This is what Ukraine need. We know Ukraine need to mobilize new low-end combat formations. When it's happening in the UK, getting training, we know there's guys getting ripped off the street, and the massive mobilization that's going to have to take place any day now. I can't believe it hasn't taken place yet, but that they're going to have to come into defensive ops to get that experience and then move to areas before they can launch offensive operations. Because if those guys go straight into offensive, you will have large losses. And like they say, without suffering heavy losses in large-scale attacks, building up experienced low-tier combat formations generates the capability for future offensive operations. This is exactly what the guy off the front line was telling me the other day of the major problems that they are facing. I'll link that video here if I remember. So let's talk about this idea of that troops are just getting pumped into here, that Russia's pouring men in, and that Ukraine is then attriting them down. That's why it's worth holding in place or pushing forward. And this idea has been given for multiple cities. Most relevant, I guess, for what we talk about is, say, Bakhmut and Avdiivka. Ukraine say, Russia keep pouring men in, we're holding in to attrit down. Now, the best place to do this is not in a three-dimensional urban environment. It's by artillery, it's by drones, it's by bombs at range, especially with your own troops in hardened defensive positions, not in an urban environment. And they're positions of which you are prepared to actually fall back and provide mutual support trench to trench, and that bounding rearwards and attriting the enemy down, not holding in one space, trying even to move forward in some areas. And Russia actually got stuck in this in Bakhmut. They were very focused, or too focused, on trying to win the centre. And of course, they had massive losses in there. And this is in stark contrast to how we saw the Russians then win the fight for Avdiivka. We saw the focus on the flanks, and then Ukraine having to have a hasty withdrawal or surrender positions, and that fall of many more kilometres, and not that urban hold and fight. So given the doctrine and whatever, it would make sense to not really try and launch a huge counterattack back in here now that Russia is developing their own defensive works in here. Now, firstly, this front should never have been allowed to open this easy, but it's open. We need to move on. So once it is open like this, I do question at what point in time is the asset of this piece of territory, how much is this worth? Or has Ukraine got stuck again in this optics or the psychology for morale to try and improve morale on other areas of the front where Russia does have the initiative and is pushing, that we need to close this because that will have a worse effect there? My opinion overall of this war is Ukraine can't fight Russia in an attritional man v man, tank v tank warfare. Ukraine needs to beat Russia in the same way the Afghanis beat the Soviets and the entire coalition. And a Taliban commander said, you have the watches, but we have the time. You want to draw the war out so that the cost in both capital, human capital, and public support becomes so overbearing that then they're forced for a withdrawal. And you don't have to win any single battle to do this. The T-Man never bet the Yanks or the Aussies or the Brits in a single fight. And those who say that they didn't win the war, we left them more armed, more numerous, and in charge of the capital after 20 years. They may not have won a single battle, but they definitely won the war. I just don't see a typical force-on-force fight between Russia's resources and even its limited allies, but especially its numbers and now defensive works, being successful in your typical just up-the-guts attack. But I'd like to know what you think on this. Was there bait laid and is this playing out in this direction? Or is Ukraine taking an advantage of Russians who haven't been reinforced in this area? I hope you have a fantastic day and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.